My daughter-in-law was sitting on a bench outside the Loblaws on Yonge Street when I found her. It was February, and the temperature had dropped to -14. She had 2 garbage bags at her feet, and my grandson pressed against her side, his little face buried in her coat. I pulled up to the curb, put the car in park, and walked straight to her. "Get in," I said. She looked up at me, and I could see she had been crying for a long time. Her eyes were swollen, nearly shut. My grandson, he had just turned 6, looked at me and said, "Grandma, are we going home now?" I said, "Yes, sweetheart, we're going home." I did not call my son first. I did not call anyone. I simply loaded the garbage bags into the trunk of my car, buckled my grandson into the back seat, and drove. My name is not important. What matters is that I am 63 years old. I have lived in Toronto my entire life, and I have spent 40 years building something from nothing. My late husband and I started a property management company in the late 1980s when interest rates were still brutal and nobody thought 2 immigrants from the Philippines could make it work in this city. We proved them wrong. When he passed 8 years ago, I took over completely. We manage residential and commercial properties across the GTA, Scarborough, Mississauga, North York, Etobicoke. I have 34 employees and I know every single one of their names. I am also a woman who does not raise her voice. I never have. My mother used to say that the quietest person in the room is the one you should watch most carefully. I have tried to live by that. My son, my youngest, married his wife 4 years ago. She is a good woman. She grew up in Hamilton, trained as a paralegal, and worked hard her entire life. When they met, she was managing the legal department of a mid-sized development firm downtown. She is organized, she is careful, and she loves my son in the patient, steady way that I always hoped someone would. I approved of her immediately, and I told him so. What I did not approve of, from the very first dinner, was his father-in-law. My son's father-in-law, I will call him simply the father-in-law, because he does not deserve more than that had made his money in the late 90s in Alberta, something to do with equipment leasing during the oil boom. He had moved to Oakville when his daughter was young and had spent the decades since then convinced that this made him somebody. He was the kind of man who corrected waiters on wine pronunciations. The kind of man who talked over women at dinner and then laughed and said he was just being direct. He had a firm handshake and cold eyes, and every time he came to a family gathering he found a way, within the first 20 minutes, to mention what neighborhood he lived in. His wife, my daughter-in-law's mother, was a quiet woman who had stopped disagreeing with him somewhere around the year 2005 and had not started again since. I felt sorry for her. I also understood her. Some men grind you down slowly, like water on stone, and by the time you notice the damage, it has already been done. The first time the father-in-law said something directly offensive to me was at my grandson's 3rd birthday party. My son had organized a small gathering at their house in Leslieville, nothing elaborate, just family and a few friends, a grocery store cake with trucks on it. The father-in-law arrived with a bottle of wine he had clearly been wanting an occasion to open, and spent the first hour talking about a property development project in Oakville that he had invested in. When someone mentioned that I managed properties across the GTA, he smiled in that particular way. Some men smile and said, "Oh yes, residential. That's a good little business for someone getting on in years. Keeps you busy. A good little business." I smiled and said nothing. I filed it away. Over the next 2 years, there were other comments. They were always dressed up politely enough that you could not quite call them out without seeming oversensitive. Comments about how my daughter-in-law had married into an interesting family. Comments about the neighborhoods I worked in Scarborough, he once said, must be challenging. He said the word challenging the way people say it when they mean something else entirely. Comments about tradition, about how families functioned, about the natural order of things. My son never seemed to hear them. My daughter-in-law heard every single one, and I could see over time what they were doing to her. Then my son was offered a contract position in Vancouver. It was a 14-month infrastructure project, excellent money, the kind of opportunity that does not come twice. The plan was that my daughter-in-law and my grandson would stay in Toronto, she would keep working, and they would visit each month. It was not ideal, but it was 14 months, and the money would let them pay off their mortgage a full decade early. What none of us knew was that the father-in-law had decided this was his moment. 3 weeks after my son left for Vancouver, my daughter-in-law was let go from her job. Her firm had been quietly restructuring, and her position was eliminated. This happens. It was not catastrophic. She had savings. She had her network. She would find something else. What made it difficult was what happened the following week. She and my grandson had been living in a secondary suite in a house the father-in-law owned in East York. This had been presented as a generous arrangement when my son first moved back to Toronto, a below-market rental from family while they saved for their own place. My daughter-in-law had paid rent consistently for 2.5 years, always on time, always by e-transfer. She had records of every single payment. 1 week after she lost her job, the father-in-law called her and told her she needed to vacate the property within 30 days. He said the suite was needed for renovations. He said it calmly and matter-of-factly, the way he said everything. When she asked if he could give her more time, just until she found new employment, he told her that he had always had concerns about the arrangement and that he thought it was best for everyone if she found her own footing. She called my son. My son called his father-in-law. The father-in-law told my son that his wife had been struggling and that he was simply trying to motivate her. He said this with complete confidence, as if it were obvious, as if it were generous. My son, 6 time zones away and exhausted and trusting, believed him more than he should have. They argued. Things were said that hurt my daughter-in-law in a way that would take months to repair. She did not call me. She was proud. She had always been proud, and I think she did not want to seem like she was choosing between families. She packed what she could into garbage bags because she had not yet arranged for a moving truck. She took my grandson to the Loblaws because she needed to think, and she did not know where else to go. That is where I found them. I brought them to my house in North York that night. I put my grandson to bed in the spare room with the nightlight shaped like a moon that I had bought specifically for his visits. Then I sat down at my kitchen table with my daughter-in-law, and I made 2 cups of tea and I listened to everything. She talked for almost 2 hours. She told me about the comments over the years, things she had not mentioned to protect my son's peace of mind. She told me about the way the father-in-law had spoken to her at their last family dinner, the week before she was let go, how he had said quietly, when no one else was near, that he had never understood what his daughter saw in this situation. She told me he had used the word situation, not family, situation. I listened to all of it. I did not interrupt, and I did not make a sound except to ask her, once, whether she was warm enough and whether she wanted more tea. When she finished, I said, "I need you to send me copies of every e-transfer receipt you have for the rent, every single one." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because I want to understand exactly what kind of arrangement this was. I am a property manager. I have been navigating Ontario tenancy law since before the Residential Tenancies Act existed in its current form. I know every paragraph of it. A secondary suite, a fixed tenancy, rent paid consistently, these are not informal arrangements. These are legal ones. 30 days notice to vacate is not sufficient under the RTA in most circumstances, and a sitting tenant who has paid rent for 2.5 years has protections that most people, most landlords, even do not fully appreciate. The father-in-law had not consulted a lawyer before making that call. I was quite certain of this. Men like him rarely do. They rely on confidence as a substitute for knowledge, and they are frequently wrong. I also called a friend of mine the next morning. She has been a paralegal in Toronto for 30 years, and she owed me a favor from a situation I had helped her navigate in 2019. I explained the circumstances. She confirmed what I already suspected. My daughter-in-law had grounds to file with the landlord and tenant board. More importantly, and this was the part I had been quietly thinking about since 2 in the morning, the father-in-law had accepted rent payments for 2.5 years and had never provided a proper lease. He had also, based on what my daughter-in-law described, entered the suite on several occasions without the required 24 hours written notice. These were not small technicalities. These were violations. I did not tell my daughter-in-law any of this immediately. I first called my son. That conversation was harder. My son is a good man, but he is also someone who avoids conflict the way some people avoid cold water. He knows it is necessary sometimes, but he will find every reason not to get in. I told him what his wife had described. I told him what I believed the father-in-law had done and why. I told him that his wife and his son had been sitting outside a grocery store in -14-degree weather with their belongings in garbage bags. There was a long silence on the phone. Then my son said, "What do we do?" I said, "I need you to trust me, and I need you to not contact your father-in-law until I tell you to." He said he would. The next step took me about a week. I am not a lawyer, but I have spent 4 decades dealing with property disputes, difficult tenants, difficult landlords, city permits, zoning hearings, and every variety of human obstruction. I know how to document a case. I know what evidence looks like and what it needs to look like when it is presented formally. My daughter-in-law and I sat together every evening that week at my kitchen table while my grandson drew pictures in the next room. We organized every e-transfer receipt, 28 months of payments, not a single one missing. We drafted a detailed timeline. We documented the incidents of entry without notice. We wrote down the conversation about the eviction, the exact words the father-in-law had used, dated and detailed. My daughter-in-law is a paralegal. Once she understood what we were building, she stopped looking like someone who had been sitting in the cold. She sat up straighter, and her voice changed, and I watched her become herself again. We filed the application with the landlord and tenant board. I also made a separate inquiry. Because of my work in property management, I have relationships with people in various parts of the Toronto development world: mortgage brokers, commercial lenders, municipal staff I have worked with on permits over the years. I was not looking for anything improper. I was simply curious about the father-in-law's properties in Oakville, which he had mentioned many times over the years as a source of considerable pride and income. What came back to me over the following 2 weeks was interesting. The father-in-law had refinanced 3 of his properties in Oakville in the previous 18 months. He had also, according to records that are publicly available through the province, fallen behind on property tax payments on 2 of them. The renovation he had cited as the reason for requiring the East York suite, the renovation that had necessitated removing a sitting tenant with inadequate notice, did not appear to have any permits filed with the City of Toronto. This last point was the one I focused on. Undertaking renovation work without the appropriate building permits in Ontario is not a minor administrative oversight. It carries fines. It can affect insurance coverage. It can complicate the sale of a property significantly, and filing a false reason for a landlord and tenant board eviction citing renovation when no permits exist is precisely the kind of thing the board takes seriously. I called my contact at the paralegal firm again. I shared what I had found. She said, carefully, that this was a matter my daughter-in-law's representative might want to raise during the hearing. The LTB hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. In Ontario, this is actually reasonably fast. The system has been under strain for years, and some cases wait much longer. We were fortunate in our timing. I did not contact the father-in-law during this period. Neither did my son, as I had asked. The father-in-law had apparently expected a different response. He called my son twice during the first week and left messages that were calm and reasonable sounding, in the way that messages are when someone is trying to establish a paper trail of reasonableness. My son did not return the calls. The father-in-law then called me. I was in a property inspection in Scarborough when my phone buzzed. I looked at the name on the screen and I let it ring. He left a message. He said he hoped there were no hard feelings. He said families went through difficult patches and that he was sure we could work things out like adults. He said he had always respected me as a businesswoman. He pronounced businesswoman in a particular tone that I have heard before and that I have learned to simply note and set aside. I did not call him back. The morning of the LTB hearing, I wore a gray wool blazer that I have had for 15 years. It is the blazer I wear when I want to feel competent and unrattled. My daughter-in-law wore a navy blazer of her own. We sat in the waiting area at the tribunal offices, and she reviewed her notes, and I drank coffee from a paper cup, and we did not speak very much because there was not much left to say. The father-in-law arrived with a lawyer. This surprised me slightly. I had expected him to represent himself. He was wearing a good suit, and he looked confident. He looked the way he always looked. When he saw me, he paused for just a moment, and then nodded in the way someone nods when they are trying to appear unaffected. I nodded back. The hearing itself lasted most of the morning. The board member was thorough and patient. The father-in-law's lawyer presented the renovation argument. My daughter-in-law's representative, my contact's firm, presented the documentation we had assembled, the 28 months of payments, the timeline of entries without notice, the public records on the permit status. The father-in-law was asked directly whether he had obtained building permits for the renovation. He said the permits were in process. He was asked when they had been applied for. There was a pause. He said his contractor had been handling it. He was asked for documentation of the contractor engagement. His lawyer requested a brief recess. After the recess, the board member noted for the record that no permit application appeared in the City of Toronto database for the relevant address. The hearing concluded in the early afternoon. We did not get a decision on the spot in Ontario. LTB decisions are typically issued in writing within a few weeks. But I knew what the documentation had shown, and I had been in enough boardrooms and hearings in my life to understand the temperature of a room. We walked out into the February cold, and my daughter-in-law stopped on the sidewalk and exhaled a long breath that turned to steam in the air. She said, "Do you think it worked?" I said, "I think we said everything that needed to be said. Now we wait." The written decision came on a Tuesday morning. My daughter-in-law called me before I had finished my first cup of coffee. The board found that the eviction notice had been served without adequate grounds and without sufficient notice period. The father-in-law was ordered to pay my daughter-in-law compensation equivalent to 12 months of the rent she had been paying. He was also cited for the unauthorized entries. It was not a small amount. 28 months of below-market rent times 12 adds up to something that causes a man who has been refinancing 3 properties in Oakville to sit down. My son came home from Vancouver for a long weekend the following week. We had dinner at my house, my daughter-in-law, my grandson, my son, and me. My grandson told his father about the room with the moon nightlight and how Grandma made him oatmeal every morning and let him help stir. My daughter-in-law sat beside my son, and they held hands for most of the dinner in the way couples do when they have been reminded of something important. After my grandson was in bed, the 3 of us sat at the kitchen table, and my son asked me how I had known what to do. I said that I had not known at first. I had simply listened, and then I had looked carefully at what was actually there, and then I had used what I knew. He asked if I thought the father-in-law would make trouble. I said that men who rely on confidence instead of preparation tend to get quieter when the preparation turns out to matter. What I did not say what I thought about later, alone, doing the dishes while my son and his wife sat in the living room, was that I had been watching the father-in-law for 4 years. I had been filing away every dismissive comment, every cold smile, every small diminishment. Not out of resentment, out of attention. There is a difference. My mother used to say that the quietest person in the room is the one you should watch most carefully. I think she was also saying, be that person. My daughter-in-law found a new position the following month, a senior role at a real estate law firm in Liberty Village, a step up from where she had been. My son finished his contract in Vancouver in the spring and came home. They used part of the LTB compensation toward the down payment on a house in East York, a different street, a different landlord, their own. The father-in-law sent a card at Easter. It was a generic card, the kind you buy in a drugstore, and it said something about family and new beginnings. My daughter-in-law showed it to me and asked what she should do with it. I told her that was entirely her decision. She put it in the recycling. There is something I want to say to anyone who finds herself in a position like my daughter-in-law's, dismissed, displaced, made to feel small by someone who has mistaken her patience for weakness. The people who treat you like a situation rather than a person are counting on you to doubt yourself. They are counting on the cold and the exhaustion and the 2 garbage bags to make you feel like you have no ground to stand on. You have more ground than you think. Know what your rights are. Document everything. Find one person who has been paying attention. And if you are the person who has been paying attention, the mother, the friend, the neighbor, whoever you are, do not wait to be asked. Sometimes you drive to the Loblaws on Yonge Street in February and you put the car in park and you walk straight over. You already know exactly what to do.